This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. I'm very happy to welcome you to 2022, and welcome also to one of my favorite EWA Radio traditions, Education Stories for kicking off the new year. Joining me now is a veteran education journalist who certainly knows her way around a newsroom budget meeting. She is Delece Smith-Barrow. She is the education editor for Politico and previously was a senior editor at the Hechinger Report and reported for U.S. News and World Report and the Washington Post. Delece, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me, Emily. It's so good to be back.
Delece, let's start with the big question that's probably on every education reporter's mind right now, and that is, what is college going to look like as we head not just into 2022, but another semester?
Yeah, I think that it's still being decided in many ways because while I think there was an expectation that we would have enough vaccines available and enough masks available to resume in-person learning and in some sense of normalcy, I think with the Omicron variant, it has some colleges and universities scrambling in terms of how spring semester will look, what precautions they should take, and how they can enforce precautions that they might be, looking into. So I think there's still, unfortunately, a lot of things that are unknown, which is tough on students and the professors and just the families, because with every variant, with every new chapter, with the COVID-19 pandemic, you have to keep refining your strategy, and that's tough. So spring semester, I'm not sure what exactly it's going to look like.
Are there some trends, though, that education reporters should be watching for in terms of how instruction is delivered?
I think they should be watching for any kind of pivot to hybrid learning or just completely, virtual learning altogether. I would certainly look out for that. I think have colleges and universities either delaying the start of their spring semester, trying to push it back as much as possible so that people have time to get their vaccinations, get boosted, or simply test before they come back to campus to make sure that they're negative. So I think right now, I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, some institutions maybe changed spring break, if they end up having to delay the start of spring semester, for example. Well, you've got to figure out where you're going to make up those days. And I could see spring break, Easter break being the first thing that might be changed. And if there is a sudden switch to hybrid or virtual learning, I would be on the watch in terms of how smooth that transition is for different institutions, what professors think about that. While it does give you flexibility, I think there were a lot of educators that struggled to connect with students or even manage the technology that's needed to teach virtually. So I could see some disruption there. And then also, institutions are budgeting for implementing various COVID-19 protocols. So whether that's having hand sanitizer in every classroom or box of masks in every classroom or spacing out desks, things like that. If you go back to virtual or some type of hybrid format, what happens with all the things you've put in place to survive this spring semester? And do you get more money from your state or the federal government if now you need to do things differently because not everyone is back on campus as you had planned? So I would certainly watch the money and see what schools are spending to keep students safe and what additional money they might be asking for to keep their campuses safe.
We talk a lot about the money from the American Rescue Plan that goes to the K12 schools, and I think maybe higher ed doesn't get as much attention. So what do we know so far about how much money they're getting and what they can use it for?
So through the American Rescue Plan, which was signed into law in March 2021, colleges and universities, all higher ed institutions received about $40 billion. So usually when the federal government has given higher ed colleges and universities money to get them through the pandemic, this money comes with certain restrictions. So maybe you have to use half of it on the institution and half of it has to go directly into students' hands, et cetera. So by March 2022, for example, it'll have been a year since this money was announced. And if I was covering a community college system in Texas, for example, I would start looking into, did the money actually get distributed the way it was supposed to? Did students receive grants or, anything like that to help them with transportation or Wi-Fi or whatever they need to study and to learn? Were campuses upgraded, like I mentioned earlier, about whether it's having hand sanitizer in every classroom or mask in every classroom? Did that change happen? Is that something that you can physically see? So I would be curious about, once you've gotten the money, what happened? And I think after a year or so, you can start looking into that. I don't think every institution got the money on the exact same day. So you have to really do your research and say, when exactly did they receive it? If it was signed into law March 2021, I'm not sure if I'm covering the community college system in Texas, did they get the money by April 1st or May 1st? But nonetheless, I think once we're in 2022, you should have enough data. There should be enough institutional research for you to be able to ask, what happened with this money? Did students get it? Did the institution get the upgrades that they were asking for? If not, why? And if they really made a turnaround because of this money, I think that's a good story too. For some schools, they're going to say, we wouldn't have made it unless we got that check. Here are all the things that we did that has enabled our survival. So I think that there's a few different storylines. The most intriguing one is someone getting the money and not using it as they should. But I think there's also room, and it's also important to tell stories about colleges and universities that are surviving because of money from the federal government. Like, we need both stories.
I would also say to reporters, a caveat, remember they have several years to spend that money, and there's a difference between allocating that money for a specific program or initiative or service and actually drawing it down and paying it out. So it may look like a school has money on the books and it's unspent, but that doesn't mean it's not allocated.
That's an excellent point. One thing we know with this pandemic is that it's going to take years to do so many things, catch up students who might be suffering from learning loss, or to spend the money in the way that you need to spend it. So that's a great point about, like, it might not all be visible in 2022, but that doesn't mean that you can't start at least asking questions.
Late in 2021, the Biden administration announced it was extending a pause on federal student loan repayments. How many students are we talking about being impacted here? And what does that mean as we head into 2022?
That's roughly 45 million people who are affected by the student loan pause. Under the Trump administration, when Betsy DeVos was Secretary of Education, that's when we first saw that the payment for student loans were paused and interest rates were zero. The Biden administration continued these practices, but there was some uncertainty about when exactly the pause would end. Like, we kept seeing the end date getting pushed back, getting pushed back, getting pushed back. And even, December 2021, we were supposed to be gearing up for payments to start again, but then the Biden administration announced that we're actually going to extend the pause through May 1st, 2022. So I think that leads to a few stories. One, how is the administration going to prepare borrowers to repay their loans? I mean, that's going to be one of the toughest things to do, just messaging, just telling people, here's how you start, or if you don't have the money to repay your loans, here are your options. So I think that's going to be a big story. And then also it kind of pairs with another similar story in the sense that progressives, particularly in Congress, but they've been pressuring the administration to cancel at least some of our student loan debts. Right now, we have about 1.6 trillion as a country in student loan debt. So it's kind of like, that's a lot of money. And there are so many people that are unable to pay that back. And progressives are saying, President Biden, you campaigned on helping with student loan reform, forgiving at least some debt, things like that. Now, Joe Biden has said he's more open to forgiving $10,000 of debt per borrowers. Progressives, they would prefer $50,000 per borrower to be forgiven. So I think that as we continue to figure out what's next with student loans, whether some of it will be forgiven, or if you have to pay, what does payment look like? I think there'll be a variety of storylines for whether it's federal policy or just speaking with borrowers and their families about what their plan is if come May 1st, they have to pay this bill again. And maybe we know a lot of people have been out of work because of the pandemic, or they've had to reduce their workload. And so I think it's reasonable to expect that payment will still be very, very rough on so many families. And I would keep a close eye on what the Biden administration says and anything new they're going to implement to make this load a little lighter.
I've been fascinated by some of the stories I've read from families about how they've been spending the per monthly child credit that they've been getting from the federal government, the per child payments, what they're using those dollars for. And I would be interested to see some stories from folks who owe money in student loans, what they've done with those dollars if they're not writing that check every month.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated about what you're doing with the money instead. And then I've talked with people who said I was actually taking advantage of the pause and particularly the 0% interest rate to just keep paying them. And they've made like great strides in reducing their debt in I guess, the last 18 or 19 or so months. So I think we're probably going to have a spectrum where some people said, I can finally use that money to get a car or something else that maybe they really needed that they couldn't get before. And then I think there will be some borrowers who said, with a zero interest rate, like that was a life changer. And I was finally able to pay down a substantial amount of my debt. But I'm totally curious about what decisions people made.
We're talking with Delece Smith-Barrow of Politico about higher education stories to watch in 2022. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Delece, you also wanted to talk about an important non-COVID story on the higher education front, and that is a case that the Supreme Court may be hearing this year that could have major implications for post-secondary institutions. Tell us more about that.
So, Students for Fair Admissions, they have been leading a couple of lawsuits challenging how race is incorporated in admission practices. One of these cases involves Harvard University. So, Harvard has really come under fire for whether or not they're weighing race too much in their admissions practices or whether they are using a holistic admission strategy. And Students for Fair Admissions, they really feel like race should not be a big factor. So the Supreme Court will likely decide in early 2022 if they'll take up this case against Harvard University. And depending on how that shakes out, that could be a game changer in terms of how all colleges and universities consider a student's race when they apply. Students for Fair Admissions, they've also challenged how race is used. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, they feel really passionately about changing what's, I would say, are standard admission practices, where you consider everything from where an applicant went to high school and what their SAT scores are to their race. A lot of universities, they say they want a diverse class. They want to have people from all backgrounds, all socioeconomic backgrounds, all racial backgrounds. And so they're saying there's a holistic way to do this where race is not the number one factor, but it is a factor. So I'm not exactly sure, when the Supreme Court will take this up or if they'll decide to take up the case. But I think it's something that, again, it would be a game changer if they took it up. And if they, for some reason, if they say, Harvard, you're wrong, then I think that would have a ripple effect. Or if they say, Harvard, you're in the right, that will also have a ripple effect. But I would keep a close eye. If I were covering higher ed as a reporter, I would keep a close eye for Students for Fair Admissions, because I don't think they're going away. I think people will, whether it's SFFA or another organization, I think race and admissions will continue to be challenged. We've seen it challenged for years upon years, whether it was at University of Michigan or University of Texas in Austin. I think that this is going to be a constant issue as we as a country try to figure out how much should we think about race, and does that hurt us or help us? And if so, how?
Is there any indication about how the court might be leaning in terms of partisan, conservative versus liberal?
When Donald Trump was president, I think he had three Supreme Court justices that he brought in. So I think there is some concern about whether the Supreme Court justices, if there are enough liberal leaning justices that would see including race as a bonus, or as not even as a bonus, as a necessity. So I think there's certainly some concern there. And it's unclear whether or not, again, they'll take up the case. But I think when you look at the bench, when you look at justices like Brett Kavanaugh and other people who have been traditionally conservative, I think there is reason to be concerned about how this will affect admissions practices for decades to come. So, I mean, it really is kind of wait and see at this point. The Biden administration, I think that they're largely, not to say that they're weighing in a whole lot, but I think they're generally in favor of giving colleges and universities the freedom to decide how much they want to include something like race and ethnicity when they are evaluating candidates for acceptance.
At a minimum, it would seem that the possibility of having this case on the docket should get education reporters thinking about what are the methodologies used by my local schools to evaluate applicants. And if you don't know the answer to that question, you should get familiar with it.
Totally. I mean, every college and university is different. They have different mission statements. So it's something that you have to weigh. When you think about institutions such as historically Black colleges and universities or Hispanic serving institutions like colleges and universities, they all have a different mission that they're trying to accomplish. They have certain students that they're trying to attract. A student that's at college A may not be a good fit for college B. But I think no matter what type of institution you are, you do think about race. Even if you're an HBCU, like not every student at a HBCU is Black. So they are thinking about their diversity. Whereas predominantly white institutions, even though they're predominantly white, I think it's safe to say that many of them are looking to diversify their institutions and enroll more Black students, enroll more Latino students. So I think if you are a local reporter, you should definitely start looking into the admissions practices of your institution. Every college and university, they have Department of Institutional Research. And oftentimes, if you just search online, you can get enrollment data through their IR department. You can get enrollment data going back years. So often when I've written higher ed stories, that would be the first thing that I would look at. Like, what did enrollment look like in 2020, 2019, 2018, et cetera? And they have to have that information available on their website. So it doesn't hurt to start poking around and seeing if there are any trends. If you spot that over a 5-year period, the number of Black students greatly increased or greatly decreased. The next question is why? Was it a targeted approach to do something, or did it happen just kind of haphazardly? So I think that even though you might not be covering Harvard, you might not be covering colleges and universities in Massachusetts, even if you're doing it in Arizona, it should inspire some stories.
Those are great suggestions. And while we're talking about admissions, a couple of other areas, while reporters have those admission folks on the phone that I would ask about, is I would ask them, what are you doing differently this year than you did in the fall or spring of 2019 before the pandemic in terms of recruiting? Have you changed anything about how you're reaching out to folks, who you're looking for, or what your parameters are for acceptance? I mean, we know that higher education enrollment is down across the country, not at every institution, but at a lot of institutions. We also know that a lot of first-generation college students didn't apply for financial aid in the last year. That percentage has gone down, which is a concerning trend. We also know that a lot of men have not returned to college. So I think those are all areas where reporters have a lot to dig into in the coming year.
Definitely. Enrollment is just such a big issue right now. College enrollment has been on the decline for many years. And we know oftentimes the students who are not going to college or not returning to college are students from lower income backgrounds, students who are racial minorities. Like you said, Emily, we've seen that shift with the number of men who are enrolled. And so, particularly during this COVID era, how you recruit students and how you retain them, I mean, it just has to look different than what you were doing before, especially if a student is thinking about the fact that going to college might mean being separated, not having the opportunity to have a roommate, or possibly needing to quarantine somewhere by yourself for maybe 10 days, or the CDC has lessened that to 5 days for some people. But it might not be the experience that you saw on TV with wild parties and people hanging out in the cafeteria because we're still fighting this pandemic. So I think the means for attracting people will evolve. The selling points will change compared to what you and I might have heard when we were applying to college all those centuries ago.
All those centuries, my century, a little before your century, but may the goddesses bless you, Delece, for that. I appreciate that. But, I have to say one thing that I find really disconcerting is when I see the photos of the modern dorms and they look like hamster warrens in a laboratory
Yeah.
where you just crawl in your little hole and put your stuff on the bed and then crawl back out and don't see anybody and there are no windows. And that is not a college experience.
It's not, but I also think about if I were 17 and I had been in the house with my parents for roughly 15 months or whatever. Even that, the scenario
Yep.
you're describing sounds like heaven. I would do anything to get out the house.
You're exactly right. Perfect. You're right. It's a matter of perspective.
It's a
Fair
matter of
enough.
perspective. I've definitely heard of students saying, I don't want to go to college to pay all this money to not be able to really interact with people or to, now at some institutions, if you break their protocols, you could be expelled. So it's a different type of stress that these students are dealing with just because they want that human interaction. So, and some students have said, I'll take a gap year. I'm not going to go right now when things are so up in the air. And there are others who would have been like me and said, whatever it is, I'll follow the rules. Just get me out of this house. So I think colleges will kind of adjust accordingly. I think they'll get sharper at tailoring the message depending on what type of student they want to attract, whether it's the person who's antsy to get out the house or the person who's afraid that they're not going to have the so-called traditional experience. They'll have to kind of paint that picture for them and say, it can still be traditional because of X, Y, and Z. But I'm very curious about how enrollment strategies will change, especially if you're an admissions director and you can't travel. Maybe you're unable to go to all the places that you typically go. Like usually college admissions offices, like if there are, let's say 3 or 4 people, each of those people has a region. One person tackles the Midwest, someone else does the South, someone else does the West, et cetera. And we've seen over the holiday season how many flights were just getting canceled because there's not enough healthy airline workers to have these planes fly. Even something like how you travel as an admissions office is going to have to change. So I'm curious about all of those things. And if I were covering a state or community, I would start poking around to the admissions practices, like what are they going to do differently and how soon are they able to do it?
I did want to ask you, is there a K12 story you're interested in hearing more about?
Yes. So one thing I'm really curious about when it comes to K through 12 education is staff shortages, whether it's teachers, whether it's support staff, custodial staff. I think that we're seeing a lot of staff shortages. And I am curious about how schools are attracting new employees, what benefits they might be trying to introduce, or what selling points are they using. I think a few months ago, I heard about a state in the West, the colleges and universities. They had kind of changed their degree offerings for teachers, for people who wanted to go into education, and they're trying to get them into the field faster to kind of counteract this drop off in educators and school staff. So I'm curious to see if other colleges and universities are looking for ways to get people into the industry sooner because we don't have as many as we need to really educate the students. But it won't matter if schools are open if there are not enough people there to run the school. So I would start, if I were covering a school district, I would start to at least ask questions about staffing. How many teachers are healthy versus sick? We're seeing issues with schools having enough substitute teachers. So I think it's really become where we've reached a point in the pandemic where that's become a big issue. The incentive to become a teacher during this time, it just seems really rough, knowing that a lot of times with kids, some kids may not be vaccinated. Some kids, they have trouble wearing their mask correctly. So, and just the mental, emotional toll that these kids have gone through over the last nearly 2 years, you have to consider that, not just the lesson. So I think there are a lot of teachers that said, I just can't do this anymore. I'm going to switch careers to something that's less emotionally taxing and stressful. And I think whether you're a college of education or a school district, you're going to have to figure out, how do I make teaching attractive when it's so hard to be a teacher right now?
So many good story ideas, Delece. I'm curious, do you have any New Year's resolutions for 2022?
To stay away from COVID as much as I can. I mean, that's really the only thing I can think about, is how can I keep myself healthy? It would be very cool to go to a campus or a school and just hang out. I miss being able to see, whether it's students or other journalists, in person with the ease that I used to be able to see them. So I would love it if we could get to a point of normalcy where I could do that again. But I think my immediate New Year's goal is to just stay healthy and stay away from COVID if I can.
That's an excellent resolution. I think I'm just going to renew my resolution from last year.
What was it from last year?
Not to argue with people on Twitter. So that's
Oh, well,
fair warning,
yeah,
everybody. Not going to argue with you on Twitter. You can try
I
as much as
know.
you like. I'm just not going to do it.
Good luck with that. Good luck with that. That's a tough one.
Thank you very much. Delece Smith-Barrow is the education editor for Politico, and she kindly joined us from Washington, D.C. Delece, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Yeah, no problem. Always happy to be on.
And that wraps up another episode for us. We're going to talk about news story ideas for the K12 beat in next week's episode, so please come back and join us then. In the meantime, if there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week. Take good care of yourselves in the new year, and thank you for listening.